I would guess that everyone in the room knows that where we are today, the East Village, was at one time called Kleindeutschland, our little Germany. It didn't start out that way, of course. Throughout the 18th century, this neighborhood from 23rd Street down to about 2nd Avenue, or 2nd Street, I'm sorry, from the river over past the Bowery, was all farmland and summer estates owned by families like the Stephensons and the Delancys. But around 1808, the city had started already inching up this far. The streets were laid. And by the 1830s, the East Village was full of really elegant brick-faced homes in the Federal style and later in the Greek Revival style. But interestingly enough, that really high-toned residential atmosphere of the East Village did not last especially long. By the 1840s, those homeowners were moving north as the city kept coming along. And that same decade, German immigrants were coming into New York Harbor, first by the hundreds. Then in 1849, there was revolution in the German states. And so those hundreds of Germans became thousands, and then they became tens of thousands. And there was no Donald Trump at the time to stop it. So by 1855, New York City had the third largest German-speaking population in the world, topped only by Berlin and Vienna. And almost all of those immigrants settled right here. So all those brick-faced homes, or a lot of them, were raised to become tenements and commercial buildings. Others became boarding houses. And Kleindeutschland filled with German language banks, German language newspapers, churches. There were beer gardens, music halls, social halls. And there was a writer who visited Kleindeutschland around 1877, and his article was really picturesque in its description because he talked about the hurdy-gurdy players on the Bowery. He actually had those things. And he talked about the aromas of schnitzel and sausage that came out of the tenement buildings and the cafes. And he talked about the music that could be heard coming out of the dance halls. And he also talked about the German chatter of the little children that played in the streets. Now, the German population here was a little different than most of the other ethnic immigrant groups that came in the mid-19th century. If you think about, for instance, the Irish, they fled the potato famine. So those people were agrarian, they were farmers. They had little or no urban skills to make a living. And because they were fleeing an economic crisis, they were essentially all impoverished. The Germans, on the other hand, were fleeing a political problem. So there was a wide strata of socioeconomic conditions here. So on the lower end, you had the factory workers and the brewery workers, the people who really had no special skills. These were the folks who lived in the tenements. One step up, you had the skilled workers, like the wood carvers and stone carvers, the musical instrument makers like the Steinways, and the brewers. And then above them, of course, you had the professional people, the doctors, architects, and the bankers. Now, to be really honest, those bankers who made millions of dollars really didn't hang out here in Kleindeutschland. They moved on up to Fifth Avenue. But the point is, there was a complete strata in Little Germany of financial conditions, which leaves us today with this broad spectrum of architecture, from the simple churches and the tenement buildings to the really lavish and costly structures like the Ottendorfer Clinic on 2nd Avenue, or the magnificent Church of the Most Holy Redeemer on East 3rd Street. Now, it only made sense that all these people came into one space. They shared traditions, they shared language, and they shared religion for the most part. And interestingly enough, in the beginning years, 4 out of 5 of these German immigrants were Protestant, Lutheran mostly. 20% were Catholic, and the German Jews really did not come until later in the century. Excuse me. So when we talk about Kleindeutschland, when we take a tour, when we look at the buildings, we most often focus on the avenues. 1st Avenue, 2nd Avenue, the Bowery, where these pretty substantial buildings still stand. But tonight, I thought it would be sort of interesting to trace Kleindeutschland through structures on the side streets, in the area pretty much where we are today. Where's my page turn? There. So we're going to start with Beethoven Hall. Beethoven Hall was a social hall. Now the Germans were extremely gregarious, very social, and they built social halls, which are not to be confused with clubs. These were not membership organizations. These were more or less what we today would call a community center. Beethoven Hall was one of the very first. It was built in 1860 in the French Second Empire style. Originally there would have been a cornice and a mansard roof. Those were lost in the 20th century during a fire. And of course, originally it wasn't painted white. It was red brick with brownstone trim. Nevertheless, it's still a handsome building even with those alterations. Now, Beethoven Hall was like all the rest of the social halls. There would be 30 of them, at least 30 of them, by the turn of the century. They were multi-purpose buildings, and they would have had large assembly rooms, large banquet halls. There would have been at least one lecture hall for musical presentations or lectures. There would have been amusement spots, like bowling alleys, very often in these buildings, and rifle ranges, believe it or not.
on St. Lawrence.
There you go. You'll repeat that in a second. The German men were really, really, really into their guns, their rifles. And there were at least a score of rifle clubs in Little Germany. The very wealthy and affluent, or the affluent and large rifle clubs, built their own clubhouses, like
Schutzverein.
there you go.
What, say that again?
Schutzverein.
Yeah, it's a magnificent
It
building.
literally means, yeah,
It's a wonderful building.
And it has on a facade, you can still get a mile, because you're in North Florida, New Jersey now. They still have Einheit Mark Stark, which means unity makes strong.
There you go. So the smaller ones would rent long-term space in a social hall like this. And they would install their own rifle ranges and clubhouse rooms. So the rifle clubs were really a big deal. And annually, each one of them would have tournaments with prizes and things like that. So that's what Beethoven Hall was. And I think the most poignant event that took place in Beethoven Hall happened in January of 1880. Nearby, there was another social hall called Turn Hall, T-U-R-N. And there was a wedding and a subsequent reception one evening. The reception was on an upper floor. Fire broke out downstairs. A lot of the guests were trapped. Many jumped from the windows to try to escape the flames. And in the end, 11 people died. Now, sadly, 6 of those were children. So 2 days later, a mass funeral for those 6 little children took place here in Beethoven Hall. 2 of those were a brother and a sister, Margareta and Willie Gelb. Willie was just 6 years old. And his little casket had a spray of flower flowers with an inscription that said, "From his little playmates." So you can imagine how heart-tugging this ceremony was, this service was. You can also imagine what the decorations in that hall looked like, with the trappings of Victorian mourning, all the crepe and the wreaths. Well, the next day, a local newspaper described the funeral procession as it left Beethoven Hall. And it said, Fifth Street was lined with 10,000 mourners. And as the procession came down Fifth Street, it was led by the Aschenbordel Society Band. And we'll talk about that group in a minute. But I think that very short description that the newspaper said gives us such a compelling picture of what life was here in the 1880s. These thousands of people standing on the sidewalks, watching all these little caskets go by, and in the front was this German band playing a dirge. It just really, really kind of gives us a pretty vivid picture. Now, as the decades went by, Beethoven Hall became a favorite venue for political and labor meetings. Those blue-collar German workers that we talked about a little bit ago that lived in the tenements, they were very, very quick to embrace the socialist ideas that came over from Europe, especially unionizing. They were very quick to latch onto those ideas of improving the workspace and improving salaries, hours, things like that. It was such that when William Randolph Hearst spoke here to a labor meeting, the New York Times, which was not especially sympathetic with the labor movement, did not say that Hearst was coming to Kleindeutschland. He didn't say that he was coming to Little Germany. It reported that Hearst was going to be speaking in the anarchist belt. And actually, a couple of years later, Leon Trotsky spoke here too. It was here that the American Garment Workers Union was formed, but it wasn't all politics and labor. In 1895, the American Bowling Congress was formed here in this building.
All right.
So all of the professional regulations that are used today started right here. And it was from this building that the first national bowling tournaments were organized. And just to show you what the place was like in its heyday, this is one of the banquet halls here in Beethoven Hall. You can see the size of these rooms. This was an anniversary banquet for the United Hebrew Printers Union. So it was a pretty big deal. This is the Aschenbordel Verein building. The Germans were very, very fond of music. They were big into music. And these musical societies cropped up. There were quite a few of them. The Aschenbordel was the one we spoke about, whose band led the funeral. That was a band. They would have had an orchestra. They would have had all different sizes of instrumental groups. The Aschenbordel, as I just said, was instrumental. There were others that were choral, but the two never crossed paths in the same thing. Aschenbordel Verein was one of the first of the musical societies. It was formed in 1860, and it was one of the largest. By the 1880s, it had more than 600 members. In 1873, they hired the German-born architect August Blankenstein to design a building for them here on East 4th Street. It didn't quite look like this. We'll talk about that in a second. Aschenbordel, because it was one of the largest and it was one of the oldest, it had some extremely esteemed musicians in its membership. One was Theodore Thomas. You may have heard of him. In the 19th century, he was nationally known as a conductor. Towards the end of the century, he moved to Chicago, where he founded the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Another was Leopold Damrosch. He was the father of 20th century conductor Walter Damrosch, who no doubt know. Now, Leopold Damrosch was one of the founders of the New York Symphonic Society. And their biggest rival, their greatest rival, was the New York Philharmonic Society. And so in 1880, there happened to be a very uneasy coexistence in this building when the Philharmonic Society lost its clubhouse, if you will. And they came here and negotiated to rent space in this building. So for a while, the Symphonic Society and the New York Philharmonic Society shared the same building in a very uneasy truce sort of way. Now in 1893, Aschenbrodel started building a larger clubhouse, and they sold this building to the Schillerbund Gesandverein. Right? I said that perfect, right?
And it's Stein, not Stein.
The Schillerbund was a vocal group. They weren't instrumental. The first thing they did was hire the architectural firm of Kurzer and Roll. They were originally from Germany, to redo the facade. They're responsible for the way the building looks today from the waist up. And it was they who put in these incredibly beautiful window surrounds. Now these look like they are carved brownstone. They are actually cast iron. Astounding. And we are so fortunate that these full relief busts of German composers still survive today. It's pretty astounding that they are. Now the Schillerbund did not stay here very long. They were gone by the turn of the century, and the building became just a lecture hall. And in 1901, following the assassination of William McKinley, it was renamed McKinley Hall. That didn't last very long either. In 1904, it went through another conversion. Now, as we're talking about these buildings today, I'm only going up through the German history of the buildings. But I'm going to make an exception for this one last manifestation of this building because it's so fascinating. The turn of the last century, there were hundreds of newsboys in New York City. And the newsboys were street urchins. The newspapers called them street Arabs because they literally had no permanent home. They just slept wherever. They made their money by selling newspapers and, frankly, by petty theft. And there were philanthropists and charitable organizations who built what were called newsboy lodging houses, where these boys could go and get a meal and stay overnight and hopefully get a bath. And some of them actually had classes where they could learn a trade, like woodworking, for instance. But there was another boy, his name is Jack Sullivan. And Jack was a little older. He was a teenager. The newspapers called him the king of the newsboys. And he was literally known citywide. Jack Sullivan might have been a newsboy, but he was extremely intelligent. And he was extremely resourceful. And his whole goal was to improve the lot of these newsboys. That's what he wanted to do. He was very observant. He watched this whole labor movement that was just coming into play in America. And he saw that these unions were going strike. They would just stop work. And then the employers would give them what they wanted. So twice he organized a newsboy strike across the city. Unbelievable. And it worked. He actually raised the amount of money that the boys got for selling newspapers. Well, another thing that he noticed was the men's social clubs. Now, every gentleman in New York at the turn of the century was socially obligated to have at least one membership to an upscale social club. And they always had a reading room, a library, a smoking room, card room, billiard room, very often a gymnasium, and always sleeping rooms. Now, the reason that these wealthy men needed to have sleeping rooms in their clubs was not only to accommodate out-of-town members, and there were some, but also in the summer months, their families would close down the mansions, take the entire household staff, leave like 2 over the summer, and they'd go off to Bar Harbor or Tuxedo Park or Newport. But these men had to come back to the city to conduct business periodically. So they had no place to stay, so they would sleep in their clubs. But Jack Sullivan didn't have that grandiose an idea, but he did see portions of that concept that he thought could work for the Newsboys. So he convinced some businessmen to buy this building, spend $5,000 to convert it to what Jack Sullivan called the Newsboys Athletic Club. Inside was a fully stocked modern gymnasium, modern for 1904, a library, a reading room, sleeping rooms upstairs. And so Jack put out across the city the news that all these newsboys could come here for free. They could use the gym, sleep on fresh sheets. Sounded great. Jack Sullivan was a very, very resourceful, intelligent guy who knew how the only way these kids were going to improve themselves. So when they got here, they found out they couldn't use the gym, and they couldn't sleep overnight until they went to the library and read a book. So that's the story of Jack Sullivan. He was an incredible, incredible character. He pops up all the time in early 20th century New York history, and someone needs to write a biography if they haven't. This building is the German Oddfellows Hall. Early in the 19th century. I'm sorry. The Oddfellows Club was organized in Lower Manhattan on Grand Street. It was a magnificent building that encompassed an entire block. It is still there today, highly, highly altered. And it was organized on a lodge system, sort of like the Masonics are today. Well, in 1888, a group of Germans here decided they too should have an Oddfellows Club. So they formed one. And they hired an architect whose name was William Freund. Guess where he was from? He was a German. They hired him to design this clubhouse. It sat on the site of a former house. It was completed in 1890. And it was a marvelous piece of architecture, especially as it rose up to this exploding parapet and cornice up here. All of this stonework was done, no doubt, by German stonecutters. And of course, there's this dramatic stoop that rose up to the double entrance doors, those two little doors on the ground floor service entrance. All the carving is still intact today. This wonderful pseudo balcony with the female face sticking out of the foliage. And you can see we've sadly lost that incredible parapet and cornice. Well, the German Oddfellows moved into this building in October of 1890, and they immediately were in trouble. And the trouble came from their next door neighbor, whose name was Peter Leidig. Herr Leidig was extremely upset with his new neighbors. He said that there was bowling into the night. He said there was bands playing, and there was singing, and there was no rest to be had. And he accused the German Oddfellows of depriving him of the pleasure of life and property. Well, it prompted the New York Times to run a headline that said, "Strong-lunged singing and boisterous bowling at the German Oddfellows." Well, the case went before a magistrate, He listened to both sides, and he dismissed the case. Well, that prompted the New York Times to run a follow-up headline, and that one simply said, "Leidig must stand the noise." I think the most heartwarming story to come out of this building happened in August of 1894. Now, everything we've talked about Little Germany up to now has been about schnitzels and sausage, hurdy-gurdy players, bowling and bands and singing, and it sounds like it must have been a great place to live, right? And it was, to a point. But if you lived in the tenements, it was much less so. The tenement buildings in 1890s Kleindeutschland were dark, they were ill ventilated, they were fire traps. If they had running water, it was cold water. And in the summer months, they were insufferably hot. They were insufferably hot to the point that on August 1st, 1894, just in that one day, as an example, 221 babies died in the New York tenements. The condition was such that one newspaper started a drive, which they called the Sick Babies Fund. It was an annual drive, and they would ask their readers just to send in whatever amount they could. And that money went towards financing visiting nurses who would go into the tenements, go into the apartments, and check on those babies and those toddlers, and if necessary, remove them to a clinic or a hospital, baby hospital, to save their lives. So in August 1894, 3 little girls in Little Germany, the oldest was 12, they learned about the Sick Babies Fund, and they wanted to help. I think this is pretty heartwarming because these 3 little German girls probably had very little worldly goods themselves, but they wanted to help. So they decided that they would put on a fair. Now, some of you may know that in the 19th century, the way that women did fundraising was to hold a fair. Sometimes they called them a bazaar. They were usually in the basement of a church or in some assembly room. So if the church needed to pay off its mortgage, or if there was a clinic to be built or something, there would always be a fair. And what they were was simply a room with a bunch of tables and a lot of stuff for sale. Very often it was homemade fancy goods, embroidered tablecloths or napkins or pillowcases. There would be foodstuffs like jams and jellies and cakes and pies, just an array of things. So those 3 little girls came here and they asked for a room, and they got it. So now they had to sell something. So they went out into Kleindeutschland, they went to the shops, they went to the bakeries, and I can guarantee you they went to a whole lot of Hausfraus. And they put on a fair. And they raised $18. Now $18 in 1894 would translate to about $450 today, which still is not a great deal of money. But I think that's not the point. The point is that one day, that one fair, put on by those 3 little girls, really exemplifies the cohesiveness and the community spirit here, because they managed to get the entire community to fall behind them and put on this fair for the sick babies. Well, I've been talking, you may have been looking at this picture and mourning the fact that we've lost that fabulous cornice and parapet, but if you look at the first floor, you may not feel so bad. Not pretty. Just a few blocks to the west of us here on 6th Street is this marvelous church. This is the Lutheran Church of St. Mark's. It was a German language church. This building was put up in 1847 at a time when almost to a one, American Christian church architecture took the Greek temple form. It would have been square or slightly rectangular, fronted by a great colonnaded portico with a triangular parapet. Pediment. This building stepped away from that. With the clustered pilasters on either side, it's an amazing piece of architecture, and it's astounding that it's still here today. In 1848, St. Mark's moved in, and they would stay in this building for decades, through the turn of the century. In 1880, their pastor was getting up in years. He was not doing well health-wise, so they hired an assistant pastor. It was 26-year-old George Haas, H-A-A-S. 2 years later, he became the pastor. And George Haas was extremely involved in the German community. And he was especially focused on the poor Germans, the ones who lived in those tenements. So one of the things that he initiated was an annual outing, a summer excursion. And what that was every year, for one day, he would take the German women and children, or anyone else who cared to come, on a picnic outside of the city. And that got those German women out for one day, away from the drudgery that their day-to-day drudgery. And it took those children from the streets on a boat ride, which was pretty cool, to a picnic ground where there was grass and trees and fresh air and ice cream. So on June 15th, 1904, the church embarked on its 17th annual summer excursion. They spent $350 to rent this boat. It was a 235-foot long, steam-powered side-wheeler called the General Slocum. Around 9 o'clock in the morning that day, 1,300 women and children boarded the boat. Now, there was a German band on board, and there was a crew of 35, but other than them, there were very, very few men. That's because it was a Wednesday morning, so all of those men were at work. Around 10 o'clock that morning, the General Slocum was just slipping into the Spuytenduyvil area of the East River. That's the most turbulent, most dangerous part of the East River. A couple of the women looked over to the Manhattan side.
Hellgate.
Hellgate, not Spuytenduyvil.
Looked over to the Manhattan shore, and they saw people waving their arms. They assumed they heard the band and the children. They knew it was an excursion ship. Oh, and they waved back, but that wasn't the case. Those people had seen smoke. A fire had broken out below deck, and eventually it hit a locker that was full of flammable materials. That exploded, and within seconds the fire reached the first deck. Now, as you can imagine, pandemonium broke out. What none of those people on board that day could have known was that the captain, whose name was Van Schaik, had never instructed or drilled his crew on emergency procedures. He had never once inspected the emergency equipment. And in years of painting and repainting the hull, no one had ever bothered to hoist the lifeboats. So by now, they had become permanently painted to the hull, affixed to the hull. Well, the crew turned on the fire hoses, and they immediately burst because they had tried out over the years. women grabbed the life jackets, strapped their children in, and threw them into the river. They had no way of knowing that over the years, the cork lining had desiccated. It had become a powder, and when that powder mixed with the river water, it formed a heavy sludge that simply took the children under. People who jumped off, many of them were just swept away by the turbulent currents. In several cases, they were sucked up into the side wheelers and battered to death. And some of the women, because they were wearing corsets and Edwardian dresses and high-buttoned shoes, were simply weighed down by their clothing. It took 18 minutes for the General Slocum to burn to the waterline. Of the 1,300 people on board that day, 361 survived. It was the greatest loss of life in New York City until the World Trade Center disaster.
And for kids to survive, they handed them a nickel and told them to take the silver, take that, go home.
So, every single person in Kleindeutschland lost someone that day. Either an immediate family member, a relative, or a friend. There were men who came home from work that night to find out that they had lost their entire family. Possibly no one better exemplifies the personal tragedies than George Haas himself. George Haas and his family, George Haas and his family lived in this house, which still stands at 64 East 7th. It was one of those fine brick-faced homes that we spoke about at the very beginning. Originally, it was 3 stories and an attic. This 4th floor was added in 2009 by the current owner. And the high tone of this residence when it was built is exemplified by this incredible entablature, which is carved with groups of berries. Very unusual and very expensive at the time. If you ever get a chance to get over here to see this house, check this out. I've never seen anything like it, and I've seen a lot of entablatures. So, in this house lived George Haas, his wife Annie. She was 46 years old on the day of the tragedy. Their 2 children, a son and a daughter, Annie's sister, and her mother. Everyone from this house was on board the General Slocum that day, except for their son. George Haas later remembered that when the fire reached the deck, he grabbed gathered his family around him. And he said he couldn't really remember if they jumped or if they were pushed, but they ended up in the river. And they were in the river. He was clutching as tightly as he could to his wife and his daughter when a body came flying down from the hull, landed directly on top of them, broke his grasp, and he never saw his wife and daughter alive again. George Haas was rescued, but he was horribly, horribly burned. Annie was identified, and a few days later, her funeral was held in this house. By that time, George Haas had received telegrams of condolences from all over the country and even the world. He received one from the standing president, Theodore Roosevelt, and one from Kaiser Wilhelm. This was a German catastrophe. When the mourners came in that day for the funeral, they found George Haas seated behind a folding screen. And the New York Times explained the next day that was because had those mourners seen him, they would have been horrified by his condition. While that funeral was going on, a second hearse pulled up. That's this one. This is Annie's hearse here. Annie's sister had been identified by her jewelry. When those coroners and those undertakers who were working with hundreds and hundreds of bodies realized that this was Ani Haas's sister, they quickly put her in a casket, sent her in a hearse to the Haas residence because they knew that Ani's funeral was going on, and quite frankly, they could just get two out of the way. George Haas's daughter and his mother-in-law were never identified, or either not identified or not found. This was the sort of tragedy, personal tragedy, excuse me, that played out throughout Kleindeutschland for weeks, over and over and over, as bodies were identified and repeated funerals were held. The General Slocum disaster was the end of Kleindeutschland. The pain and the memories were just too severe to endure. So over the next few years, one by one, little by little, the entire German community left Kleindeutschland and went to Yorkville. But before that was completed, excuse me, a group of women got together and they called themselves the Society of Sympathetic German Ladies. They raised money and they commissioned the German-born sculptor Bruno Louis Zinn to sculpt a memorial fountain for the people who were lost, especially the children, in the General Slocum. It was dedicated, it was unveiled in 1906 in Thompson Square Park. It is a beautiful pink marble memorial that includes a drinking fountain. There were two children on the front who were looking off to the sea, and on the side it says, "They were Earth's most precious children, young and fair." Now those German ladies erected this monument so that we would never forget the General Slocum disaster and the people that were lost that day. And unfortunately, as Mark Twain once said, civic memory is very short. And today, hundreds of people walk by this monument, this fountain, and never pause to wonder why it's there or what the story is behind it. Now, this was the last thing erected in Kleindeutschland by the German community. It was the very last relic of Kleindeutschland. So I think it's really a fitting memorial, not just for the Slocum, but it's a monument to Kleindeutschland. It's the last piece of Kleindeutschland that we have. And that's about all the time that I have, besides Kleindeutschland's over. So if you have any questions that do not require German pronunciation,